Most people believe something that simply is not true, and the moment you understand it, the entire dynamic between you and law enforcement changes. Most people believe that when an officer says, "We don't need a warrant," the conversation is already over. They assume the law has already been decided, that resistance would be pointless, that whatever is about to happen is simply how the system works. But here's the reality that doesn't get explained on television, and almost never gets explained on the side of the road. When an officer says, "We don't need a warrant," that sentence is not the end of the legal discussion. In many cases, it is the beginning of a psychological negotiation that most people don't even realize they're participating in. And that misunderstanding, right there, is where the trap begins. I've reviewed hundreds of body camera videos. I've read thousands of pages of police reports, suppression motions, and courtroom transcripts, and the pattern appears again and again. A person is standing outside their car or in their living room doorway, or sometimes just on the sidewalk next to their apartment building. An officer asks for permission to search something. The person hesitates. The officer responds with a calm voice and a confident tone. "We don't need a warrant." And at that moment, something inside the average person collapses. Shoulders drop, hands go up. The internal assumption becomes, well, if they don't need one, then I guess I can't stop it. But the law is rarely that simple. There is a phrase, one simple sentence, that changes that moment completely. It doesn't start an argument. It doesn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It doesn't escalate the situation. But legally, it places a clear boundary in a way that courts understand. The phrase is this: "I do not consent to any searches." Not, "I'd rather you didn't." Not, "Do you really have to?" Not, "I guess it's okay." Just calm, steady, and clear. "I do not consent to any searches." That sentence matters because the Constitution does something very specific. Under the Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures are supposed to require a warrant issued by a judge based on probable cause. That's the starting point. That's the rule written into the foundation of the system. But here's where it gets complicated. Over the last century, courts have created a long list of exceptions to the warrant requirement. If you've ever watched real body camera footage, you've probably seen them in action without realizing what they are. There's the automobile exception, there's search incident to arrest, there's exigent circumstances, there's plain view, there are protective sweeps, and perhaps the most common exception of all is consent. Consent searches happen constantly. In fact, they happen so often that most people think they're mandatory. An officer asks, "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" And people say yes, sometimes because they want to cooperate, sometimes because they feel intimidated, sometimes because they believe saying no will make things worse. But legally speaking, consent is incredibly powerful. If you say yes, you have just removed one of the biggest constitutional protections that exists between you and the government. Now, this is the part most people misunderstand. When an officer says, "We don't need a warrant," they may believe that statement is true. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it depends on facts that aren't even clear yet. Sometimes it depends on whether certain legal thresholds have been met, thresholds that only a judge will evaluate later. But the moment you say, "I do not consent to any searches," you have done something extremely important. You have preserved the legal issue. That may not sound dramatic, but in a courtroom weeks or months later, it can become the entire case. Let me paint a scenario that I've seen more than once. A driver gets pulled over for a minor traffic violation, maybe a broken taillight, maybe drifting slightly over a lane line. The officer approaches the window and starts asking questions that have nothing to do with the traffic stop. "Where are you coming from? Where are you headed tonight? Is there anything illegal in the car?" The driver is nervous. Most people are. Heart rate goes up. Adrenaline kicks in. Hands feel shaky on the steering wheel. Even completely innocent people feel that rush of anxiety when red and blue lights appear in the mirror. The officer asks, "Mind if I take a quick look inside the car?" The driver hesitates. Then comes the sentence, "We don't need a warrant." Now think about what that statement does psychologically. It creates the impression that refusal is meaningless, that resistance is pointless, that compliance is inevitable. But if the driver calmly says, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches," something subtle but important has just happened. The officer now has two choices: either proceed under a recognized exception to the warrant requirement or stop. If they proceed, their justification will later be examined by a judge. And if that justification isn't legally valid, the evidence that comes from that search can be suppressed. This is where it turns. Because the phrase isn't about stopping the officer in the moment. Sometimes it will. Sometimes it won't. But its true power is what it does later, when the legal system reviews what happened. Let me be honest with you. Asserting your rights will not always make things easier in the moment. That's the hard truth nobody likes to hear. Officers are human beings operating in stressful environments. They deal with danger, deception, and unpredictability every day. When someone refuses consent, some officers take it professionally and simply move on. Others become more suspicious. A few may become visibly irritated. That doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means you've created friction in a system that often runs on compliance. And this is where body language becomes incredibly important. When you say, "I do not consent to any searches," the delivery matters. Calm tone, no sarcasm, no raised voice, hands visible, no sudden movements. You're not trying to win an argument on the roadside. You're preserving a legal boundary. Your posture should communicate something simple. I'm not fighting you, but I'm not giving up my rights either. Now here's where things get even more nuanced. There are situations where officers truly do not need a warrant. If they see illegal contraband sitting in plain view, the law allows them to seize it. If someone is arrested, certain areas within their immediate reach can be searched for weapons. If there are exigent circumstances, like imminent destruction of evidence or a real emergency, the courts recognize those realities, and vehicles are treated differently than homes because of mobility. The automobile exception allows officers to search a car without a warrant if they have probable cause to believe evidence of a crime is inside. But notice the phrase I just used. Probable cause. That's not a guess. It's not a hunch. It's a legal standard. And here's the trap. Consent eliminates the need to prove probable cause. This is why that sentence matters so much. I do not consent to any searches. When that phrase appears on body camera footage, it forces the legal system to answer a question later. Did the officer actually have the legal authority to do what they did? Without that phrase, the argument often disappears. Let me tell you about a case that illustrates this perfectly. A young man was stopped late at night on a highway outside a mid-sized city. The officer claimed he smelled marijuana coming from the vehicle. The driver insisted there was none. The officer asked to search the car. The driver said yes. Inside the trunk, the officer found a backpack containing illegal substances. The case went to court, and the defense attorney tried to challenge the search. But the judge asked a simple question. Did the driver consent? The body camera footage showed the driver shrugging and saying, "Yeah, go ahead." That was the end of the suppression argument. Now, imagine that same scenario with a different response. The officer says, "We don't need a warrant." And the driver calmly responds, "I do not consent to any searches." Now the officer must rely on the alleged smell of marijuana to justify the search. The defense attorney can challenge whether that smell actually existed. Cross-examination begins. The credibility of the officer becomes relevant. The legality of the search becomes a real issue. One sentence can create that difference. Here's where this gets complicated again. Some officers genuinely believe they are acting lawfully in these situations. They are trained to detect indicators of criminal activity. They are taught to read behavior, body language, inconsistencies in answers. From their perspective, consent searches are a tool that helps them do their job. But from the perspective of constitutional law, consent is also one of the easiest ways for rights to disappear. And many officers know that most people will agree to a search simply because the authority figure in front of them sounds confident. Confidence is persuasive. Authority is persuasive. Uniforms are persuasive. That's basic human psychology. Add flashing lights, adrenaline, and fear, and the average person's ability to think clearly drops dramatically. This is another reason the phrase needs to be simple. I do not consent to any searches. Not a speech, not a legal lecture, just a clear boundary. Now let me address something that people often ask. What if the officer ignores you? What if you say you don't consent and they search anyway? This happens, and when it does, the worst possible thing you can do is physically interfere. Courts consistently treat physical resistance as a separate offense, even if the search itself was unlawful. The correct response is to repeat the phrase calmly. I do not consent to any searches. And then let the situation unfold. Because the place where legality is ultimately decided is not the roadside. It's the courtroom. Judges review body camera footage. They listen to testimony. They analyze whether probable cause existed. They evaluate whether an exception to the warrant requirement applied. But they can only analyze what is documented. If the footage shows a person calmly refusing consent, that fact becomes part of the legal record. If the footage shows someone casually agreeing to a search, the legal argument becomes much harder. This is the gray area that television rarely shows. On TV, rights are dramatic speeches delivered at perfect moments. In real life, rights are usually quiet sentences spoken in uncomfortable situations. Let me say something else that may surprise you. Refusing consent does not make you look guilty in court. Jurors are routinely instructed that exercising constitutional rights cannot be used as evidence of guilt. That principle exists because the founders understood something fundamental. Rights that people are afraid to use are not really rights at all. But using those rights requires preparation. Adrenaline is real. When your heart rate spikes, your brain narrows its focus. Fine motor skills decline. Memory becomes unreliable. People say things they didn't plan to say. That's why rehearsing the phrase matters. If the sentence has never crossed your mind before the moment happens, it's much harder to produce it under stress. But if you've said it out loud before, even just once or twice, the brain retrieves it faster. I do not consent to any searches. 4 seconds. That's all it takes. And yet those 4 seconds can determine whether a constitutional argument exists months later. Now, none of this guarantees a perfect outcome. The legal system is complicated. Judges disagree with each other. Facts evolve. Evidence appears or disappears. But understanding how these moments work gives you something most people don't have: clarity. Because when an officer says, "We don't need a warrant," they may be correct. Or they may be testing whether you know the difference between authority and consent. And that difference, quiet, subtle, almost invisible in the moment, is where the Constitution actually lives. So the next time you watch body camera footage online, pay attention to that moment. The request for consent, the hesitation, the answer. That answer determines more cases than most people realize. And if you take nothing else away from this conversation, remember the sentence that anchors the entire situation. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just calm and clear. I do not consent to any searches. Say it once if necessary. Say it twice if they keep asking, and practice it until the words come automatically. Because in the moment when adrenaline is high and authority is standing a few feet away, the simplest sentence you already know is the one you're most likely to say.